Thank you, Peter, for the warm introduction. I'll be presenting the paper Follow the Money: Are Severe Weather Events Value Relevant? This is a joint project with Professor Lisa and Professor Shiva at Columbia Business School. In recent years, the number of major natural disasters declared by FEMA has been on the rise. And majority of this increase is driven by disasters which are associated with climate change. For example, coastal storm, droughts, wildfires, and floods. This has given a rise to the debate whether how these kind of climate events impact businesses. Several influential commentators like Vanguard, SEC Chair Gary Gensler, and IMF have argued that these natural disasters negatively impact firms' financial performance. There have been few academic papers that have documented the negative impact of these disasters on both public firms' financial operation as well as stock market reaction. Regulators have also contemplating to make disclosure of climate risk mandatory. Recently in 2024, SEC have made a regulation of climate risk disclosure which makes it mandatory for public firms to disclose their climate risk. On the other hand, there is another side which documents that climate disasters have unlikely to affect the cash flow of public firms on average, and only a small proportion of major catastrophic events have any impact on firms' return. Ponticelli 2023 poised three mechanisms that could insulate larger firms from weather-related losses. The first one being that most of these larger firms are geographically dispersed. So even if one location gets hit by any kind of a weather event, there are other locations which could still operate efficiently. Secondly, these larger firms have access to finance, which could help them to get back to their status quo after suffering any kind of loss after a major event. Lastly, they have access to high managerial skill, which could help these companies to better adapt and mitigate to climate events. These arguments have led us to a first research question that whether severe weather events have any impact on financial performance of the firms. However, till now, the most of the debate in the media and in the regulators have been concentrated on the public side of the economy. Often an important segment is ignored in this debate, which are the private firms. Private firms is an important part of the US economy. More than 99% of US businesses are privately held, and they account for 44% of the US economic activity, employing more than 56 million workers. However, most of the climate debate ignores the impact of private firms. On the policymaker side, there is no policy on any kind of private firm disclosure, and on academics, there is a lack of research because there is no data. However, climate change as well as natural disasters are pervasive and have an impact on both public as well as private firms. Private firms are usually smaller than public firms and therefore more likely to be suffer from the impact of climate change. Including private firms in the regulatory scope would avoid opportunity for window dressing, wherein a public firm can shift most of its climate risk businesses into a private subsidiary and can avoid disclosure. Also, private equity is increasingly seen as an important contributor to the return of public pension funds and endowment of non-profit institutions. So it's really important to know what is their exposure to climate risk. Therefore, a second major question is whether these kind of severe natural disasters have differential impact on public versus private firms. To give you a brief background of our research design, we look at following databases. For public firm, we use the database called CompuStat for financial data and CRIBS for market data. For natural disasters, we look at all the major disasters which have been declared by FEMA. We exclude the man-made disasters and we exclude those natural disasters which are less likely to be associated with climate change, for example, volcanic eruption. Then to figure out whether a firm is exposed to a natural disaster or not, we use a database called InfoGroup. In info group, we get establishment level sales volume and employee data for public as well as private US firm. What this helps us is to identify how much private firms get impacted by a weather event. Lastly, we look at the small business assistance data to figure out how much financial assistance is given to these small businesses when a weather event happens. Our sample period spans from 1998 to 2023. To give you a brief background of our main findings, we first look at the impact on the stock market returns of public firms. We look at the window of -1 to +1 surrounding a weather event as well as -5 to +5. We find that when a company experiences any kind of a weather event, its stock price could fall as much as by 1.3%. However, we find that this impact is heterogeneous across industries. Certain sectors like consumer durables, business equipment, manufacturing, and shops are more likely to be negatively impacted by these weather events, whereas there are certain industries like telecom, finance, and healthcare which seems to be unimpacted. Also, the market response is different based on the disaster types. Named disasters like Hurricane Sandy or Ian and floods appear to be more associated with a negative stock market response compared to other disasters like wildfires and coastal storms. Next, we look at whether this impact is different for public versus private firms on the operational side. For this, we use the sales volume data of Infogroup and check whether if in year T, a firm's establishment has suffered any kind of a natural disaster, what is the change in sales that firm has experienced. Here we find that most of the private firms are the ones which get impacted when there is any kind of a natural disasters. On public firm sides, there are only in few sectors like healthcare and consumer non-durable where there is any kind of major impact on sales. Next, we look at if any kind of financial assistance could help these firms better mitigate the impact of these disasters. We find when small business assistance is given to firms, they are able to mitigate the negative impact of the extreme weather events. And this impact is stronger for private firms. This is because these kind of assistance are generally given to smaller firms which by nature are more likely to be private than public. Lastly, we checked whether geographic diversification could help firms to mitigate the impact of weather events. Here we find whether it's a public firm or a private firm. If a firm is more concentrated, that is, their operation is based only in one state, they are more likely to be impacted in case of weather events instead of when they are well diversified and have operations in more than one state. So to conclude, we see that our findings suggest that climate risk does leave a detectable financial imprint on the stock return of public firms and operating performance of the private firms. However, the impact is more acute for private firms. In contrast, when we look at the disclosure regulations around the world, it tends to overemphasize transparency associated with climate only for public firms. Private firms is almost always ignored from this debate. However, I want to point out few limitations about our current model. Like what we study is only one of the realization of physical climate risk. It ignores other kind of risks such as transition risk, like when there is a change in regulation or people move on from like a fuel intensive to more like an hydrogen intensive kind of an environment. It ignores other realization of temperature change, for example, temperature rise, which has been looked by a few other academic papers. However, what our setup helps us is to isolate the impact of an exogenous climate phenomena on firm's performance. So it helps us to control any kind of endogeneity of whether a firm is knowingly going into a business which is high transition risk versus not. Secondly, all of our study is based on past severity of disasters. As we have looked initially that the number of disasters is being on rise, So if in future the severity of these weather-related events also increase as predicted by IPCC, then our results might not be applicable. Like the impact could be more stronger. By this, I would like to conclude, and hopefully our project would help us to contribute to the debate of this climate risk disclosure. Thank you.